Little something that I was pondering. I had the opportunity to be looking at my notes from teaching by Kemper Rinpoche when we went to India in January, and I was looking at one section, and in it he was talking about how it is that in order to practice deeply, we actually have to give up on our confidence that samsara will turn out to work well for us. And for those who don't know the term, samsara in general refers to the cycle of confusion and suffering, dissatisfaction that churns and churns and churns, driven fundamentally by the continual churning of ignorance and confusion, not seeing how things are. And I thought, well, I looked at my life and I thought about all the ways in which I still bet heavily on samsara. I bet heavily on circumstances working out to my advantage in so many ways, and why it was so difficult to let go of that. And I came down this morning, it occurred to me that in our modern world, I can blame it all on the remote. Whatever it is, you can press the button and you can switch the channel somehow. If the weather is crummy with a couple of $100, you can either go someplace where there's enough snow to ski or nice warm beaches to lie on. So the weather is completely... We can be entertained in so many ways. That's, of course, the origin of the remote, to be able to sit on the couch and flip madly through what at that point was only half a dozen channels. And now we can become fully entertained by simply looking at the number of possibilities for ways to be entertained. We can spend as much time as we would spend on an average movie just trying to pick which movie to look at. And there's so many ways that we can make choices where we can kind of essentially press the button and escape situations and move on to something else. And it's very nice that we do have the possibility for making choices, say, about our health and whether or not we can have a new knee or a new hip. It seems to be working well for you at the moment. Yeah, good. I'm glad we have these choices, but there is a certain point where we still, it's broken. We don't get the menu doesn't come up and give us another choice, and in that situation, really being able to find the well-being that is actually kind of our intrinsic character, being able to connect to that is the most reliable thing, and it's we have to be careful about our how much we rely on the remote. If we become only good at kind of working our thumb, and we don't spend the time to actually look into our own experience, look into how well-being can actually open in the midst of all experiences, look into the nature of our mind eventually. If we don't spend the time on that, that resource won't be there when that's the thing that we need to rely on. And so I wanted to share that in part because I thought it was kind of funny myself when I realized that was kind of my response to life. Was, I'm bored here. I think I'll go for a walk. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll do that. So we could have a Samsarics Anonymous.
That's what we are.
Yeah. So now it's your turn. One of the things that I noticed in conversation recently was that we're blessed to have all kinds of people with all kinds of interests and all kinds of levels of practice. And in our discussions together, the variety of questions and which reflect both different levels of practice and engagement and different styles of engagement, I think it makes for a very rich and rewarding circumstance. So I wanted to, before you even had a chance to say anything, I wanted to thank you for what you have said already, and thank you for what you will share in the way of questions and grist for the conversation. So what's on your mind? What's on your mind? What would you like to go into?
Okay, it's just as a reminder, Deborah will be the mic runner so that the streamers get to hear your question also, because otherwise the answers won't make sense to us when we play it later.
If only that was the only reason they didn't make sense.
I'm wondering if you find with teachers from other cultures that kind of course, they've, such as the one that you were describing this morning, grew up with the sense that there was something more than samsara. But I also feel like it's really part of the American dream, especially for the middle class, that you work hard and then you get the reward. And then you'll be happily ever after, you know. And so I wonder if it's culturally harder for us because we have that dream sort of given to us from the get-go, that hard work has its payment, and there's that sort of expectation that you reach a spot that is therefore less conflictual and less problematic as your reward. So I'm just kind of wondering if the teachers that you have from other cultures and maybe their students have a little less of a sense of that promise than Americans do.
I feel my first impulse is just to say, well, are you more or less asking me to agree with that analysis? And I can see easily to kind of nod my head in general, but then I look at the particulars, and it really depends on a lot on the specific experiences that people have and the degree of good fortune and privilege that people have, as to whether or not you actually believe that if you bet all your chips that it will actually pay off. You might have the experience that you bet a lot of chips and they're just good, the rules continually change. This is a kind of a karmic Calvin ball where you change the rules in the middle of the game so that you can never win. There are a lot of different possibilities, but it's certainly something that even the traditional teachings they spend a lot of time analyzing how it is that samsara doesn't pay off. Samsara is problematic, intrinsically problematic. So it's actually something that human beings have to be reminded of, and no matter what their cultural circumstances are. And in order for it to actually add up to something where it really comes down to a sense of going for refuge, you have to have kind of the good news, bad news joke. You need to know both sides of it. You need to understand the bad news of that betting on continual sources of gratification is limited at best, if not frequently intrinsically problematic and harmful. So you need to have that kind of understanding. But you need to also have some kind of confidence that there's something else to do. Otherwise, it's like, why talk too much about the bad news? If there really wasn't an option, it would just be kind of like insult to injury. So the possibility that there is liberation is part of what through the critical piece of understanding and appreciation in going for refuge, that it is actually possible. But I think in this culture, or in any culture, and I think it's not necessarily cultural, though there is a long-term resonance that develops in cultures, but a lot of it just has to do with a certain window in technological and economic development. There's a certain window in which it looks like before you get there, it's like there's so many limitations that it's lucky if things turn out well. When things start to develop, it appears to me, anyway, this is just my theorizing about stuff, it appears to me that the promise becomes very kind of big neon flashing light promise. It's all going to work out if only. You can be happy when, and this and that. And you can hear people say, well, I'll be happy when. But they have a when, and they think it might actually come. And then there's a point, I think, where the acceleration of improvements tapers off, the rate of acceleration, or the new thing seems to be just like the old thing in some intrinsic way. That it's like, well, it was just having a telephone. Now it's having a mobile phone. And at a certain point you think, well, then there's going to be something else. But I'm still not actually intrinsically that much more content. I don't actually experience my well-being intrinsically in a deep way more than when, we just got a party line telephone. So there's a certain point where the acceleration starts to become suspect as a source of well-being. But I think that's great disparities of circumstance lead to a very kind of problematic situation on many accounts. And one of them is that people with less means might believe that as long as you got incredible wealth, then it would all be, everything would be okay. I've forgotten which blues singer said this, but she was quoted as saying, in response to this, kind of this notion that, well, rich isn't all it's cracked up. She said, I've been poor and I've been rich, and I'll tell you, rich is better. So I think it's worth actually not being too intellectual about saying it's all the same. It's all the same, because there's a lot. The disparities of circumstances, which have existed in different ways ever since, as far as I can figure out, they are still part of the situation that we have to deal with, and that's enough. I know. But the cultural piece is interesting. There are different things that actually come up just from the cultural piece.
I'll just add a little bit to the ponderings. I think the main thing I thought of first was what you said, like, these are the old original Dharma teachings that say we're all looking for happiness outside, and that's not where it's going to come from. So clearly, that's been the case for human beings, and that's at the crux, no matter whether it's past, present, future, or this country or that country. I think we have that tendency, and that is at the crux of what we need to work with, look at, and see how it plays out in our own lives, and validate that for ourselves. And that's a big piece of the Dharma path, is then to work with that tendency to see the problems out there, and think that the solutions are out there. And we need to examine and see how that may not be the way we thought it was. But they're definitely, in the particulars, everybody's situation is different in this regard. And I was thinking, one thing that's happening now in the Asian cultures is where, for instance, the Tibetans and their diaspora outside of Tibet, in India, where they have, monasteries and that kind of thing. Well, now things that are, one trend is that, monks, maybe they'll be in the monastery when they're younger, but then as they get older, they start to see the opportunities outside, and it looks more inviting than it used to. It looks like there's these things, they could have a great life if they weren't in the monastery anymore. Whereas in the past, it probably just looked like, well, it was the same old, plow and the same whatever that their parents had, and didn't look as attractive. But now they have, internet and phones and, all communications, and then just the, cultural change, where it's drawing people away from what they might have been satisfied with in the monastery. And then you could go interview them and see how it works out 10 years later, and see if that, if they're thought of, oh, that would be so much, I'll be much happier then, and see how that worked out. But anyway, so it really does seem like everybody has their particular brand of this, but we all have, we all have it. I was thinking, but there is a real intensity. I mean, I look at, for instance, in our culture, oh my God, the number of customer surveys I get, right? So we're like, invited to fine tune, how someone talks to us on the phone, and whether they satisfied our every this, and whether we, at the same time they're getting what they want, and we're just like, yes, perfection can be reached. It's like, it's definitely part of what is in our message, and the customer is always right, so that should mean that I should never have a bad experience, that I can't, say that, well, that was your responsibility why I had this bad experience, and I'd like you to fix it, and okay, good. So that whole thing, while I'm not saying there shouldn't be that kind of, feedback and whatever, but just when I look at that and say, yes, that really does lead us, could lead us towards, one of the many things that could lead us towards thinking that, yes, we can perfect this samsaric experience, if only X, Y, and Z, and A, B, C, D.
The word perfect, we've noticed in the past couple of years that when we've gone to a restaurant to search for this, the better experience, that we order something and the wait person says, "Oh, perfect." It's like, at best we can say pretty good, pretty darn good, but perfect is just like, isn't that just betting a little bit too much money on this? It's like, this is crazy. It's we tend to think of ourselves as busy. That's like, oh, well, back in the olden days when all you had to do is sit on a rock and watch the sheep for a day, busyness was not a problem. And I think there's something to it, but I'm reminded of this, the prayer in prayer referring to all the realms of experience that beings can find themselves in talking about the human realm of experience, where we're driven by the force of desire and attachment and experience the suffering of excess activity and frustration. Excess activity. This is hundreds of years ago, written in a Himalayan situation. So it's something kind of like, well, we shouldn't feel too sorry for ourselves. It's like, okay, we do have our challenges, but how are we going to make it work in the midst of those challenges? It's not impossible, but we do have to work. So, yes.
This is probably going to be like a meandering, wandering question. So it has to do with, one of the four thoughts that trains the mind to enlightenment is precious human life. Mm-hmm. And although it was interesting that your prayer indicates some things stay the same. And, in our culture with medical advances, you have to, there are things that you can execute, which is like do not resuscitate, and so on. And I also remember a story, one of the Kalu Rinpoche books about the Buddha, and obviously probably a little more in touch with absolute truth, of giving up one of his lives to bleed out to nurse a tiger or lion so that being survives. And so that's my question is kind of like this trade-off between, precious human life and I'm sorry if there's anybody who's 85 or above, and may you have a very bright mind, but you're like, well, I'm 86, I'll go for open heart surgery, whereas in many cultures in the past you'd be dead quite a long time ago. So I'm not, if you can find a question in there, those are kind of my meanderings. It's like, well, would a good Buddhist execute a DNR? Or, what I mean? Because you have precious human life, but and where's that balance?
Yeah. The word balance is always tricky. That's kind of like, that's like the word perfect. We'll get it all weighed out on one side and the other side, and we'll know exactly what to do because we've balanced it all out. So apart from thinking that that's not really, I'll just sort of discount that as a possibility. Then there are all the different particulars of circumstances that people find themselves in, and it's worth pondering deeply what makes a human life precious, or what makes any particular human life precious. And if you really get down to the heart of it, the possibility for liberation, or cultivating the circumstances that lead to liberation, is really the heart of the matter. And there could be people for whom a DNR makes perfect sense, and people for whom it doesn't. And I think you have to ponder that, to see that, as opposed to, I'm going to avoid being drawn into thinking out kind of recipes for that. But it's not an easy kind of choice to make. But the one thing that I have noted is that we have essentially up to the point where we have to say, in our culture, we now have to say something like DNR, because up to that point, we've been saying the opposite of that, like fix absolutely everything at pretty much any cost. And then after we stop saying that, then it looks kind of shocking in comparison. But it's the possibilities that we have to extend at any cost up to whatever point we say, no, stop. It's more shocking in that circumstance. But I think one of the things, just to go back to the theme of how to, not so much how to, but there's just the possibility that it's actually possible to find profound well-being that's not dependent on circumstances. It changes the equation some. But you actually have to practice deeply in order for that to really unfold beyond a theoretical basis. An intellectual understanding of that is not enough when pain and suffering is really extreme. But it's possible if we do cultivate just our basic calm abiding and do not hold some ideal about a state of meditation. That's, if I do my calm abiding right, I will get to this very pleasant state of meditation, which is kind of akin to going, la, 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 I can't hear you, to withdraw completely. And then there's this sense of peace. That was a great meditation session. I felt completely calm and peaceful. Nothing came to mind. Nothing happened. And somebody might say, oh, that's nice. Another teacher was feeling a little bit more like to say, oh, my condolences. You didn't have an opportunity to actually cultivate anything of value. You basically just hit the pause button. And as soon as you take your finger off the pause button, all the rest of it's going to come back. So being able to find and appreciate even that capacity for just not holding on to a circumstance and letting go. Doing that over and over and over again in calm abiding can actually provide degrees of freedom that we don't really imagine, because we think the freedom would actually come from getting rid of it. I got rid of that circumstance. I put an end to it, and now I'm okay.
And in my question, I didn't say anything about grasping, right?
No.
Which was another aspect of it, because you're grasping for you're having this attachment to this being and long life and so on, which I think is what you were addressing.
Yeah. There are a lot of dimensions to it. Now we can go in and if we don't like how we look, we can get that fixed. My chin's starting to sag. I'll get that pulled back up. I like Phyllis Diller's joke. She'd had so many facelifts that she couldn't go to a funeral anymore because she's always face is kind of stuck. Yeah. Good there.
My name's Doug, and we've been talking, among other things, about busyness, and I think for the last 2-3 weeks, I've been going through this very unsettled time in my mind, I think related to to some extent to external circumstances, one of which is retirement, which kind of is a shock to the system. But what I was finding was such a busy mind that I would literally start to sit and then feel compelled and remember all these very important things that needed to be done right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or alternatively, I might be doing some of those important things so that I wouldn't have time to sit. And it isn't that this is a completely new problem, but it has just been sort of hitting me in a very intense way. And I did finally think of one thing that was helpful after quite a long period of time. Because what I would try to do is focus on other things besides what was going on with me, and I couldn't do it. So one thing I found helpful was if I actually focused on that feeling of needing to get up right now and do something,
Mm-hmm.
which took me a while to get to that point where I actually thought of doing that. And then every time I would feel the urge to get up and go do that project in the garage, rather than just sit, I would then not get up. And then it was kind of interesting. Oh, interesting. But I guess I just bring this up as kind of a circumstance that I would be interested in your input about, because there are probably all kinds of things that can be done productively under those circumstances. But I just have found sometimes that when I personally find myself in that circumstance, those solutions don't sort of immediately necessarily come to mind.
Yeah. That's one of the things that it takes a lot of training for the habit to have some method come to mind, whatever the method is. It takes a lot of training in order to have that be kind of close enough to the surface that it's one of the options. It's an option. When you're first talking about kind of jumping up and running to do something, I immediately thought of when I first started to meditate, and there were several times that I actually found myself standing in front of the refrigerator with the door open, just kind of checking to see what might be interesting, and not even realizing that I had gotten up from my cushion. So I'll just kind of throw that out there to just kind of, you can sort of hold that out as kind of one extreme for wandering, where the mental wandering actually turns into physical wandering. But over time, I did manage to, I haven't caught myself doing that lately anyway. The notion of bringing your attention to that experience is a way of bringing a great gentleness into the moment. Instead of treating the experience of that impulse as an enemy, it's not entirely benign, but it's not an enemy either. As long as we're compelled, there's something problematic, as long as we're lost in the compulsion. But the first piece of understanding, I think, is just in that instant of recognizing that I don't need to be driven. And that can come just in being able to let go of a thought and bring the attention back to the breath. Or just simply let go of a thought. Once we realize that we don't have to be driven, then that the possibility of just resting our attention, and we also, if we cultivate the ability to just rest the attention on some aspect of our experience, we have some sense of how we do that in a way that's not lost in some kind of agenda. It's not lost in ideas. We're just bringing the attention to the experience of the breath, for example. If we do that, then we can think, oh, it might be possible to just bring my attention to the experience of this impulse to jump up and go do something, without having cultivated some bit of training about just the technique, the method of the skill of being able to bring our attention and just rest it. It doesn't actually make sense to bring our attention to the experience of this highly charged thing, because we wouldn't have any option but to be lost in the thought of it and in reactions against the thought. Sort of there'd be the either giving in or fighting. And so that ability to just bring that same, you could say the same move from just resting the attention on the breath to resting the attention on that experience. And in the same way as the breath comes and goes, there's a flow of experiences. It's not just one, it's not just the breath, and it's not just the impulse to leap up and do something. It's a whole flow of experiences, and being able to rest the attention within that, and finding the degree of freedom that's there. That's a great opportunity for discovering that actually we don't need to get rid of the experience to find some degree of freedom within it. And that degree of freedom brings some kind of well-being with it. It brings the freedom from a sense of coercion. So and you can go deeper with it too, over time. But that's a great it's a great method, and also long time, many centuries, people have been doing exactly that as part of practice. Is there something more?
No, thank you. That's a beautiful description of part of what my experience was when I finally got around to that.
Yeah. You have anything to add?
Well, I'm no good at responding to the other question of, how do you cope with having a really busy period? Just that, that is, I think there's different ways of, just looking at that and seeing, okay, it really looks like I have to either shrink my practice sessions for a time, or I have to do this or that. Maybe I can try to do more things in the middle of the day for a minute or two in order to keep some continuity, or that kind of thing. And I think for me, the danger is when I start making these exceptions to, say, any pattern of practice I might have had going, then does that become a new normal, and then it's really hard to get back. And so somehow kind of working with ourselves to, I think sometimes we do have constraints that we can't do our practice the same way every day because of circumstances. But on the other hand, trying to look and work with ourselves to remember what it is we really want and to try to pursue that, and to get, back to a routine that might have been good for us and that we interrupted for a time. But I have no magical ways of handling that.
Just remembering to practice is cultivating the ability to remember to practice is actually a huge piece of practice. We may have our formal schedule of practice, but then applying ourselves when we're not on the cushion. That, as you said, like it doesn't always occur to you to do this. It doesn't always occur to us to take a moment to check in during the day. And the more that we cultivate the habit to check in, and we can actually overcome the resistance of this seemingly bulletproof logic that says, I don't have time for this. Because almost, dozens of times a day, we do something like, sort of we just shift gears momentarily. We're not like a tape loop that just is never quiet, ever for an instant. There are moments where we shift gears. And if we take advantage of those moments and one of the classic things is just to bring the attention fully to the experience of the breath one time. There's something that becomes, the more that we do that, the more that the basic skill or the basic move of being able to let go is cultivated. Then we can do that over and over again. So we have, instead of a day where we're trapped, if nothing else, by the idea that we're trapped, we have a day that's interrupted by these many moments of not being trapped. And that's a very different day. And the more that we do it, the less of a big deal it is on one hand, but the more of a cumulative big deal it is. So it's actually a really important piece. And then there's a certain point where every once in a while, and this I remember when we were at the stupa in Bodh Gaya early on for one of the seminars, we had the experience of usually our meditation is kind of often interrupted by distraction. And while sitting at the stupa, we talked about it and we said, yeah, it's kind of like the way you might say it, like, our distractions were interrupted by meditation. And so it was. So there, it gets to be there. The more you invest in the practice, the more it can be like that, where it just sort of it occurs, kind of something. Oh, in the middle of this, sort of like this kind of little tiny joke, like actually not caught. Right in the middle of this, not caught. So that's a good thing to cultivate. But now it's time. So we can dedicate. This virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Thank you all.